Hey everybody, Aaron Bishop here with another Bishop's Blurb. You've heard it by now. One of my pet peeves is the tendency of people to engage in what I call soundbite theology. What is soundbite theology? Well, if you haven't caught one of my previous videos on it, this is when a person takes a single phrase out of the context of the surrounding passage and the entirety of Scripture, frankly, and they build some sort of doctrinal stance on this simple statement. The first example that I presented was the tendency of many to take "judge not that you not be judged" as a stand-alone statement. But it's not a stand-alone statement. When we examined the context of that passage, we recognized it wasn't a blanket statement of "do not judge." It was more about examine yourself first before you begin to enter into judgment against others. But not as a means of condemning this other person, but rather as a means of trying to lift them up out of this place of darkness that they're in. Using part of a verse in this way, it's like using Psalm 14:1 to say, there is no God. Because, Psalm 14:1 actually says that there is no God. But when we read the context of the sentence that this soundbite appears in, we find that it's the fool who says in his heart, there is no God. The context changes the meaning of the soundbite. Now, because this is such a common issue, I am going through some of the most commonly misquoted and misused passages of the Bible. And when examining context, we've seen that there are several levels that should be looked at to determine if the context allows for a particular interpretation of a passage. Now, we've already looked at the immediate context of a passage, the surrounding text that helps us to determine the meaning of the passage. We've gone to quoted texts from other places of the Bible and used the context of those other places in the Bible and their context to import it into the current passage to help us to better understand what's being said in the current passage. We've looked at how the historical context of a verse can shift our understanding of that verse or passage to give us a better understanding of when we could possibly use it in a contextual way. Well, this video, I want to look at how the entirety of the works of an author can help to determine the meaning of a passage as part of the context that should be considered when you are reading a passage. And a good example of this is found in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. I can win this sports event. I can climb this mountain. I can get that promotion. I can do anything I set my mind to because God gives me strength. Now, often this verse is used to speak of winning the competition or achieving the grand goal. But is this what Paul meant when he wrote this verse, or are we just using it as a soundbite that's been stripped of its context? Well, let's look at the immediate context first and see if we can gain some more insight. Philippians 4:12 through 13. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, in the immediate context, we can see that this passage is not about achieving some goal, but rather it's about living in any circumstance, whether good or bad. It's about making it whether you win or lose. And if we look a bit earlier in the book, we'll find that this greater context is even darker than just simply this. For example, Philippians 1 verse 7. It is right for me to feel this way about you all because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. Here we see Paul connect his well-being while in prison for the sake of the gospel to God's grace. He can be content in prison because he can do all things with God's strength. At the end of chapter 1, we read this in verse 29 through 30. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. I can suffer because he gives me strength. In chapter 2, we see the same phrase, all things, used in an interesting way. Philippians 2:14 through 16. Do all things without grumbling and disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that you did not run in vain or labor in vain. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. Could this be the same all things that Paul is speaking of later in the book? And what is all things in this context? Paul seems to be really focused on remaining true to the faith in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, and doing so without grumbling or disputing amongst yourselves. If we look just at the scope of these 4 chapters of Philippians, we can see that doing all things through Christ who strengthens me isn't about achieving a goal. But if we look at the other works of Paul, we can find some really disturbing things that Paul had to endure, which also falls under those all things. 2 Corinthians 11:24-28. 5 times I've received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all of the churches. Nowhere in any of his works does Paul even infer that this idea of I can do all things has any bearing on accomplishing some grand task or winning some great competition. Instead, this verse, when we consider all of the context, it's about having the strength to endure hardship, imprisonment, and persecution. It's about standing firm in the face of the insurmountable. And when these insurmountable things come upon you, you can endure because God has given you strength. Seeing this passage in this way, it completely shifts the narrative away from I can achieve greatness to I can survive this terrible circumstance because of God's strength. As I'm going through this series on context, I have a question for you. Do you have a passage that you hear others constantly taking out of context that you would like me to cover? If so, just drop a reference to the passage or verse in the comments below, and I'll look into making a video for you. And while you're at it, comment, like, share this video. You know how the internet works. If you appreciate the work that I put into this channel and its content, then spread the love and let me know about it.